it has a significant oil and gas extraction production that contributes to global emissions, and at the same time, Norway is among the most ambitious in the Paris Agreement. So significant, yes, because it's a large part of the Norwegian economy. 50% of Norwegian export is oil and gas, and 30% of the public revenue comes from there. So, but in global terms, of course, Norway is very small, only 0.5% of world GDP, nevertheless 2% of oil supply. So it's a big, relatively big activity. So one possible solution to this dilemma is to use extraction cuts as climate policy. So is it then possible to affect climate in that way, and is it worthwhile? The background for posing those questions are, first of all, Michael Hall's article in '94. And based on that, we can say, yes, in theory, it's cost-effective for a country to curb global emissions by a combination of demand-side and supply-side policies. And we did an empirical investigation of that question in 2017 in Energy Journal, and we saw that, yes, also in practice, cutting supply of oil will reduce global emissions, and the optimal combination for Norway was actually calculated so that 2/3 should be done by oil supply reductions and 1/3 by demand side for a given global contribution. But since then, the Paris Agreement has come, and we ask in this second paper whether supply-side policy is still a good idea. So then we will revisit unilateral supply-side policies. Will it still give global emission reductions? Then we will also go into the insurance argument, which was posed in 2016 by Bård Harstad, which is topical because the Paris Agreement is, of course, uncertain what the outcome will be. We will also look at whether it's worthwhile. When it comes to whether there will be global emission reductions, we will look at oil only. Gas is another story, much more uncertain what the effects will be. We can look at different effects. Of course, the most direct effects is that when you keep oil in the ground, the CO2 content will also be kept in the ground. And there will also be some emissions from extraction that we will save. On the other hand, when it comes to the oil market, when it arrives to the oil market, there will be a price increase so that global consumption, yes, it will fall, but there will also be a supply incentive to increase supply. So the net effect is not that obvious. And then you have this substitution effect that even if oil consumption is reduced, there will be some replacement by other fossil fuels. So if we now concentrate on those three for the time being, before we take the last Paris effect into account, these are the findings that we had in the previous paper, that we have 1 unit of reduction in the direct reduction, and some small impacts also on the extraction emissions. Then it will be it will be counteracted by increases in other supply, and they have some more emissions from extractions, but that is a very small contribution to it all. And then we have the substitution effect, so that the net effect that we found was about 1/3 of the gross effect. Yes, so this was, didn't put those on, but that is what I said. So what is then the Paris effect? What is new with the Paris Agreement? When we compare to the Kyoto, where there were few participants with ambitious targets, the abatement of these few participants would imply carbon leakage to other countries. In the Paris Agreement, with the bottom-up approach, there are different ambitions in different countries, but there will be targets for every country. And that makes the difference. Because if those targets are binding, then we can get some emission reductions from these three first effects, but then a shadow price of carbon will fall in the countries that have these targets, so that the emissions will increase again until the target is exactly met. That means that we get a full carbon leakage and no effect of supply-side policy at all. But the question is, of course, whether this is binding. And we argue that in many countries there are no clear targets. There are targets conditioned, and they are conditioned on unclear conditions. There are some countries, many countries actually, that have so low ambitions that even without efforts they will be met with good margins, so that it means these targets are not binding. And also the Paris or the UNFCCC as an institution has a challenge in how to measure and monitor all participants. What do we do if commitments are breached? And what will happen after 2030? So there are lots of reasons why we don't look at this agreement as binding for all the countries involved. So the preliminary conclusion is that yes, there will be some effects, but it will be smaller than before the Paris Agreement. But then we have the insurance argument as well. Because there is large uncertainty about the Paris Agreement, and of course if there are low expectations to the outcomes of the Paris Agreement, too little abatement will be done and invested in, and a failure becomes more and more likely. So then supply-side policy can work as an insurance. It will ensure that at least some combustion will be curbed, and the most dramatic effects of climate change avoided if we have the supply side in place when the agreement might not succeed. And Norway is, of course, far too small to make this very significant, but if we can manage to make a supply-side coalition which is larger, then this could be an effective insurance. There are also some signals from supply-side policies that cannot be ignored. The signal could be that we believe that the Paris process will succeed. Therefore, we leave resources in the ground. We expect that they have a low value above the ground. And we will not take on the high costs of stranded assets. And if this coalition is influential and large enough, this signaling and the cost effects can spread so that Paris becomes more likely. So the third question is whether this would be worthwhile. And yes, for suppliers that wish to reduce climate change on top of the pledges that they have in the Paris Agreement, then the relevant question is, what is a cost-effective package of such on-top measures? And in that package, many elements might be included, like R&D investments, green fund transfers, rainforest conservation, and also supply-side cuts. And why do I believe that supply-side cut is part of this package? Because on the margin, there will be no costs of doing another saving of a barrel. Of course, as you walk up this marginal cost curve, it will be more and more costly, but we will move somewhat in this package. But what if the UNFCCC process turns out to be a success? Is it still worthwhile? At least it does no harm, because there were no added climate effect, but it was not much added costs either. The unextracted resources would have been unprofitable anyway. It could even reduce costs, as I mentioned, by avoiding stranded assets, and that will make the demand-side efforts less costly. On the other hand, there might be some costs of coordinating and negotiating in a supply-side agreement, though. So, but costs will more or less be negligible. So to conclude, yes, supply-side policy is still a unilateral option that can obtain to add to the global abatement, because the Paris Agreement as is not binding. And even if Paris Agreement becomes binding, it will have a role because it will make it easier for the world to obtain the global goal, and it can work as an insurance if Paris fails. But it's important to emphasize that Norway is small. We need to initiate this kind of work in a more larger supply-side coalition to make this very effective. Thank you.
So we tried mapping all countries with significant fossil fuel reserves according to the criteria of the Lofoten Declaration, who some of you probably know. The Lofoten Declaration, signed by almost 500 NGOs, says that leadership should come from countries with significant production in the past, high income at present, and democratic leadership. So we use the term extraction-based emissions, accounting for historical emissions based from combustion of fossil fuels extracted in that or this particular country, and adjusted them for non-energy use factors from Richard Heady, who is also here in the room. So what we got here, on the horizontal axis, we have historical extraction-based emissions. On the vertical axis, you have GNI per capita, the level of income, and then the size of the bubble is the cumulative guess at reserves in terms of gigatons. Guess because Ron Steenblick, also in the previous session, referred to the BP data on reserves as fiction. But this is the best fiction which is around for free, so we're using it. And marked in red are bubbles with coal reserves, coal-dominated fossil fuel reserves. Blue are oil and gas-dominated reserves. So it's not talking about distributing the carbon budget in any way, because it's an approximation for a number of assumptions. But you see that for high-income countries, they are in the upper part of the graph. We expect leadership to come maybe on voluntary basis. Then there is a separate discussion, which Glada also mentioned, and there will be more presentations about it, about least developed countries, low-income countries that probably need assistance in their transition away from fossil fuels. And then in the middle, 40% of reserves, 40% of extraction is the BRIICS countries, and they all have coal-dominated reserves. So the question is, like, what do? They are not too rich, not too poor. Can we hope for some action on supply side in this group? And carbon entanglement also, of course, means the entanglement of budgets, and that's the specialization of my institute, and many of you know the Global Subsidies Initiative. So we tried to look at the national statistics from finance ministries and look how much exactly the revenue from fossil fuel production is coming in these countries. And we also looked, of course, at the revenue from fossil fuel consumption. And fossil fuel consumption here is just basic taxes, if they exist, such as value-added tax or excise duties, import duties. And here they are all mapped against the GDP. This is still work in progress. We're still looking at the data. And in positive, here you have revenues, both from production in blue and consumption in red. And in negative, you have subsidies. And a lot of people will ask, okay, so if you subtract subsidies from revenue, how much you get? This is this green dot. But this is a methodological error probably, because a lot of subsidies we're talking about here are tax exemptions. And it's not just cash. But nonetheless, you can see that this group of countries has different significance of taxes from production and consumption. And that means also that it has different applications for a potential phase out of fossil fuel production. All BRICS countries and a lot of developing countries and developed countries as well, frankly speaking, view revenues from fossil fuel production and especially government revenues as a source for development, potentially funding other energy targets, including emission reductions, but more importantly, for all these countries, basic economic development needs, social protection, fiscal deficits, and the implications, if we were to reduce production of fossil fuels in those countries, for government budgets are, of course, different for net importers and for net exporters. So for countries like India, China, which are net importers of everything, or Indonesia and South Africa for oil, the reduction in revenue will probably not be as significant, although a lot depends on individual circumstances. Because they are already importing a lot, it means that there is there are benefits such as improved energy security, improved trade balance, and ultimately the use of domestic fossil fuel resources is subject to NDCs and to the choices about economic diversification. And then the overlap also comes with demand side management, because these issues are more important, not maybe so much in terms of emissions, but in terms of true costs and impacts on health and air pollution. For net exporters, of course, shift away from fossil fuel exports, like for Russia or for Brazil, Indonesia for coal, the change is more tremendous because it has immediate effect on trade balances and earning foreign currency. And generally, the implications are very similar to those from just low oil prices at the moment in terms of jobs, in terms of sectoral and macroeconomic indicators. So here is an example from Indonesia, where we have worked quite a lot on subsidies, but that illustrates how consumption and production is linked ultimately, and how it translates into economic development and diversification. So Indonesia, along with Mexico, is one of the few countries where oil production has declined for reasons not having anything to do with climate change. It's a combination of factors such as geography, but also the management of the sector. Historically, Indonesia has been receiving quite a lot of revenue from exporting oil and gas. And of course, here you have a benchmark, the oil price. It was very linked to the fluctuations in the oil price. But what it was doing with this revenue, it was giving it all in terms of subsidies, which encouraged wasteful consumption, subsidies through regulated low prices for gasoline and diesel. With low oil price in 2015, the government finally dropped the subsidies, but it also had to do so because otherwise there was no revenue coming from oil and gas. And right now, with oil price on the rise, we see again that the government is reintroducing some of the subsidies, and both India and Indonesia have elections next year. So this is part of the story, and that's one of the reasons why replacement of revenues from fossil fuel production comes hand in hand with a lot of macroeconomic policies and phasing out fossil fuel subsidies to consumption too. So the other thing is with declining fossil fuel revenue for the budgets, the effort for BRICS countries can be still from taxing energy use more, and it's again like basic taxes such as value-added tax or excise duties. It's not necessarily even carbon tax. This is for fossil fuel consumption, and in certain countries such as China, Brazil, South Africa, there already more revenue comes from fossil fuel consumption than production. Taxing production of fossil fuels, which is quite difficult because you never can guess the price, and a lot of taxation systems depend on the assumed benchmarks. And then potentially, this is more at this stage an idea than a reality, but you can tax renewables, and there are instances such as Indonesia is taxing geothermal, and Norway has a resource rent tax on hydropower. So that may be one avenue. And finally, of course, you have to tax everything else, and you have to diversify so that the tax base grows this way. So in Indonesia in particular, there has been a paradigm shift in this respect because government was first viewing its resources as cash cow for earning export revenue, but then slowly the question became more about earning, or rather fueling domestic development and diversifying economy. And then in India, my colleague Vibhuti will talk more about India in a separate session today. There is a further shift towards viewing renewables as equally viable for the economic and energy mix as fossil fuels. So in conclusion, BRICS is a very diverse set of countries, and they represent everything. You can find everything. You can good practices, you can find bad practices there. There is a saying, it's from the 70s, from the Indonesian Mines and Energy Minister, that good times make for bad policy and bad times make for good policy. He was referring to the fluctuation of the oil price again. Some colleagues in Indonesia are now joking that bad times can also make for bad policy, so it's not exhaustive. But there are nuggets of both positive and negative examples from the BRICS, and part of our job with this report is just making them known and showing the inspiration which countries in the middle of this carbon transition can show to each other. Thank you.
So I want to present some work on one sector specifically, that's the coal sector, and more precisely some international coal phase-out work that we did with the COALMOD-World model, in the coal transition project by IDRI and Climate Strategies, where you find a lot of the reports out there on the table. And in the previous session, some of the other reports were presented, and that's joint work with some colleagues from IDRI, DIW, and Humboldt University in Berlin. So the international coal market, so the part of the market that is traded international and mostly by in seaborne trade, is here depicted in this map, where you see that, well, traditionally it was a lot of an Atlantic market, and increasingly in the past 20 years we've had a development of a very large Pacific market with a lot of consumption centers now in Asia. You see in the table, well, major producers and consumers are China, India, and the United States. So a lot of the coal production is actually consumed domestically, about 85% or so is consumed domestically. So that trade part is relevant, it's important, but it's not the largest part of coal production. We have a model at DIW Berlin, we developed it about 10 years ago, where we look mostly at the seaborne trade, but we also include the domestic consumption, where we have depicted, it's an economic model if you want, a computer-based model, the relevant actors, which are producers, the transport of the coal to either domestic consumers or to exporters, and then the seaborne trade to consumers abroad. And we include the largest coal producing and consuming countries that are on the map here. So basically we have a little threshold, about 10 million tons per year included, that excludes a few countries that are also consuming coal. But again, you have the largest players in here, China, India, and the US, of course, which I mentioned before, Australia, etc., Indonesia, we just heard a lot about. So now in the coal transitions project, we wanted to provide a little bit of the international background for the country case studies that we did in the project. The idea was to have a little bit of input from the countries where could their coal consumption, coal demand trajectories head towards 2050, where could also maybe, for some countries, we got some information on coal production trajectories, because the countries included were China and India, so large consumers and producers, Poland, Germany, also important producer still, and South Africa, a big producer and exporter, and Australia, so also a big exporter. So we developed, because we provided sort of the global background, global scenarios that were either a NDC-style scenario, which we took as a reference, or two also NDC-style scenarios where we said, well, but there could be some variation to what we know currently about coal demand and NDCs, which we called enhanced coal transition in terms of enhanced information scenarios, with either where we have a little bit of lower demand in China, India, the US, and South Africa towards the end of our model horizon, which is 2050, but some variation in between scenarios that we called ECT1 and ECT2. Mostly this is a higher China demand than this one here, which is a sort of a higher India demand for coal, basically assuming different renewable policy playing about, assuming different coal policies coming about in China. And then we contrast that to a 2 degrees Celsius scenario. So NDC is more of a 3.5 degrees Celsius coal demand style. It's really just coal demand, I should stress. And then a 2 degrees Celsius scenario where, unsurprisingly, coal demand is much lower. So that is the blue trajectory here. And if you want to go to that, then coal demand should decrease relatively quickly from now on, while the NDC style scenarios keep us in a relatively high coal demand world. So we start from almost 6,000 megatons per year of consumption and go to only above 4,000 million tons per 4,000 million tons per year. So still a very, very high level. However, with those enhanced information scenarios here for some of the large consuming countries, we have let's say about 10%, 15% lower demand by 2050, and cumulatively that is about 10% less coal used in the world between now and 2050. But still very high coal demand. Lots of the consumption, I said, takes place domestically, but still also a large part of domestic trade, and in that international trade. And in that international trade, it's still China and India as well that have major roles. So large shares of the international trade actually go to China and India, up to 85% or so even in one scenario go to China. And cumulatively, it's almost, or it's in every scenario, at least half of the international trade that's going to China and India. So with the focus of our research, looking at, well, what would happen in terms of asset stranding to large exporters if climate policy changed globally or in some regions. Well, we can say that only China and India would already have a large effect on the exporters because of their large share in international trade. So who are those large exporters that are mostly dependent on the international trade? That is, you can see them here on the slide. It's USA, Indonesia, Australia, Russia, Colombia, and South Africa. So you see it's more countries than we had in the coal transitions project, because we didn't really look in detail at the US, also didn't look at Russia and Colombia. So it's sort of could be an idea for a second project. And you see that some of them really have potentially very high exports, in particular, of course, in the NDC scenario, but also in the ECT, so still NDC style scenarios. Exports decline substantially in the 2 degrees Celsius scenario, which is the blue bar. In particular in the US. The US has sort of a swing role to play. So when import demand declines, then the US as the supplier on the margin that is first reducing its exports. Indonesia has the opposite role. It's sort of it's the least cost producer on the market. So it's sort of the base load producer, if you want, that's always feeding into the market as much as it can, depending on its domestic consumption. And when domestic consumption is lower because of climate efforts in the 2 degrees Celsius scenario, well, then it frees up more coal for the international market, and it even exports more than in the NDC scenarios. So those are the major or the largest 6 countries that would be affected if coal importing countries, let's say, change their trajectory from NDC-style scenarios to a 2 degrees Celsius scenario. And I said asset stranding. So if we look at assets and investment in additional assets in the value chain, which are production to mines, transport in terms of railway infrastructure, and then export infrastructure in terms of ports, we see, well, in the scenarios we have very different investments carried out. Obviously, in all of the scenarios or in all of the countries, the NDC investments are the highest, and the 2 degrees Celsius scenario investments, well, there mostly aren't any. So if there were a change, let's say a sudden change or an unexpected change from NDC to 2 degrees Celsius, then obviously there's really all of these investments that would take place in NDC to 2050 that would be stranded. But also already in the ECT scenarios, you can see that in particular here, if you say you stay in an NDC-style world, but the NDCs are slightly different from what we expect at the moment, you can have a lot of stranding in all of these investments because you need much less new mines, new infrastructure. And it varies depending on the country, depending on, which is the major import market for that exporter. And I said at the beginning that, China is the other big importer next to India. And for China, one reason why it's actually importing that much is because much of the demand is on the coasts, and infrastructure between the mining regions inland and the coast is bottlenecked, and we assume it's hard to remove those bottlenecks. But if those bottlenecks were easily removed, then the Chinese imports would also decline. So that's another risk, let's say, for the exporters. And just generally, we can say, there is a risk to exporters such as Australia and Indonesia for asset stranding. And despite, and that comes in addition to all the uncertainty in domestic markets, say in the US, where there's a lot of coal currently freed up from shale gas. Plus, we haven't looked at in much detail at Colombia and Russia, which have, of course, a large stake in the European market, where it's very likely, actually, that climate policy will become even more ambitious, and coal imports will decline substantially. So we have a number of countries that, for different reasons, have a risk of asset stranding in the coal sector. And in the next step, we want to look at, well, what does that mean, not just for countries on a country base, but for individual mine projects. Thank you.
So the point I want to make is that taxes on coal are a good idea for coal producers and for coal exporters, because they can raise revenue to help with the structural adjustment that will take place in those countries and in those regions, because they will be able potentially to shift the terms of trades and shift rent from coal-consuming countries to coal-producing countries, and so are inherently of interest to coal-producing countries. And because they can help to some extent, potentially, avoid a coal-taxing country taking part in that race to the bottom that we might expect in a declining coal market. So Chris Bataille talked about that this morning. By the way, I highly recommend Chris's presentation. I'd watch it again if I could. But that, of course, takes place in a highly political context. I mean, any of us here who are from or work in a large fossil fuel producing country, or a country where the fossil fuel sector is an important one, can attest to just how difficult the politics of that are. I'll take a break for advertisements first. Coal Transition Project has been mentioned in various sessions. There's still a few of the hard copy reports outside. I think the project is actually finished, but I think this is actually well worth a thought as to where to take that in a next step, to the extent that any of the organizations present here are interested in pursuing that. And a plug for climate policy. So the conference organizers are working with us towards a special issue, and it's kind of a good journal in general terms. So do keep that in mind. I'm one of the editors, that's why I'm saying that. Okay. Global coal consumption, very likely on a downwards path. These are the scenario developed by DIW colleagues for the coal transition project. From the point of view of a coal exporting country, right, you would actually see every opportunity, or some would call it risk, of a more steeply declining pathway of global coal consumption, right? Because technology is changing very, very rapidly, and renewables are becoming very much preferable in many coal-using countries. And when you look at that from a coal-exporting country, right, from Australia, for example, Colombia, South Africa, wherever, your exports are very highly vulnerable to that, right? Because when you think of the political economy in one of the major coal-using and currently coal-importing countries, right, will they be cutting back harder on domestic production or on imports if and when their domestic coal consumption declines, right? The economics of it might well continue to argue in favor of imports, right? The political economy within countries such as China and India will generally point very strongly towards favoring domestic consumption, because the same political and adjustment pressures occur in those countries as well. It's very important, right, as we talk about fossil fuels, to keep a keen eye on cost developments in renewables, right? And it's absolutely astounding what's happened just in the last 3 years or so, right? This picture is significantly different from the picture we had 2 years ago at the same conference, right? Renewables in most countries, solar and wind, are now directly in the middle, or in some countries towards the lower end of the cost range for fossil fuels in electricity generation. Okay, our scenario for Australia has domestic coal consumption reducing very rapidly through the 2030s, potentially starting to decline very significantly in the 2020s already, right? And this is before you consider the effect of any kind of effective domestic mitigation mechanisms that we may or may not have, right? This is a function of technology. It is no longer commercially viable to build a new coal-fired power station, right? You'd need a government that subsidizes it for that to happen. And the debate and the fights are all about how long the existing assets will be continuing to produce. So globally, declining coal demand, what will that mean? That will mean lower prices. Okay, that's quite clear. If you look at historical developments of coal use and coal prices, obviously, you know, the change over time in these two things is very closely correlated, and declining coal demand will mean lower coal prices. What does that mean? That means declining tax revenue, declining royalties. So, for example, in Australia, you know, the tax take from the coal industry will decline disproportionately with the decline in coal demand and coal prices. And at the same time, it translates into greater need or into a need for funding for structural adjustment. What are the pressures in the decline of coal? Well, you know, you will have the owners of existing assets clamoring for subsidies, right, to keep going for longer. You will have, to an extent, also a drive for subsidies for new investment. This is what we're seeing play out in that debate about the Adani coal mine that Richard Dennis mentioned this morning, right? If you want more coal development in an overall declining market, you know, governments will be called on to subsidize it, which is, of course, a very bad idea from the point of view of the community overall. And you will need support for communities and regions. You know, so coming from that strange little country, that big continent with a lot of fossil fuels, you know, there's reasons for why the politics look so topsy-turvy and crazy at times, right? So these are all our prime ministers that had to go because of climate policy or energy policy, or that were elected into the job because of climate policy and energy policy, and subsequently had to go. You know, and it's the resource endowment, and it's the fights over rents that lie behind all this, right? This is not just politics gone crazy, right? This is an expression of a fundamental tectonic shift that is happening there in terms of rents, right? Here's that lump of coal, the lacquered lump of coal. Okay, but that's all just part of a very much broader discourse, right? Where an economically and politically influential part of industry, you know, tries everything it can to maintain that position, right? And that goes into the public realm as well. Where, you know, an argument is created that essentially, you know, the economy is riding on the back of a coal truck, right? Which really, you know, is less and less the case. But it's, of course, in the interest of that industry to perpetuate that sense. So what sort of roles for public funding in the transition is actually we're thinking about clearly a role to facilitate structural adjustment, right? And that's where the study of other structural adjustment episodes is really important, right? Coal or fossil fuels are not unique, right? What can governments usefully do without squandering too much public money in facilitating the establishment of new industries in those regions affected, right? It's very much a regional phenomenon, and so that's really industry policy. Where'd you get the money from? Well, generally from the general budget, which means that everyone else pays, right? Which raises interesting distributional implications once that happens at very large scale. Extra taxes on coal production or just on exports, I guess that's what we're producing here, what we're suggesting here. So, you know, you have the coal producers, the share owners of coal companies, and the consumers of coal paying for the adjustment, okay? Or that you could go one step further and actually not consider this as part of taxation revenue, but consider it as an industry scheme for adjustment, right? Think of it as a levy on coal production, and that levy serves to finance structural adjustment. And in this case, maybe the role of governments conflates to facilitating the collection of that levy, okay? Put it in a fund, and that might well be politically more acceptable than actually making it a coal tax. How are we going for time, Mark? A couple of minutes, very good. Okay, so there's a number of economic effects. I won't dwell on it, other than to say perhaps the incidence is important to think through who pays for coal tax, right? So in the ideal scenario, and we've touched on that in a previous paper, which is incidentally in the special issue from the last conference. If you do it right from a coal producer's point of view, then you coordinate with other coal producers, right? And you shift the tax incidence on the consuming countries, right? And help them achieve their greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals, right? And avoid them having to put on a carbon tax. We'll put on the coal tax, the carbon tax for you, and collect the revenue. Thank you very much, right? To the extent that that's not happening, the incidence is borne by the coal companies and thereby by the shareholders. Now, politically speaking, that should actually be not such a bad thing in a democracy because, you know, the shareholders of these companies are generally a small minority in the overall population. However, they tend to be very highly politically influential, right? And that's where the interesting aspects are and how to design that. So in all of that analysis, right, I think we need to go well beyond just the standard economics, and we need to go to quite a sophisticated understanding as to who are the winners and losers, and you know what can you do about addressing the concerns of the losers. And in many instances, this actually has a lot to do with effective communication with the potential winners from such a policy, right? You need to make the winners in society aware that they actually win from supply-side fossil fuel policies so that they can come on board with it, okay? So in conclusion, coal tax is not just fiscal policy, but industry policy, can help with regional structural adjustment policy, and importantly, need to be framed as a contribution to the global effort on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Good afternoon. So I'm also representing all the co-authors of this paper that we wrote, and it's great that we had those presentations because I think they give a really good context for what is happening in Australia, which is the target region for this paper. We're actually not even looking at entire Australia, but Western Australia only. And what are the consequences of exploiting some gas resources that they have in there for their climate targets. So just very, very, very briefly, so emissions in Australia, had stagnated and were decreasing up to 2015, but the most recent numbers show that they're increasing again, basically, which is unusual for OECD countries. They're increasing, and if we look at projections actually from the government as well, you'll see that emissions will continue to grow in the coming years, which is going completely in the opposite direction to their NDC pledges, which are over here, and which are less ambitious than what the Climate Change Authority back then had recommended as a fair contribution of Australia to the Paris Agreement. So they're going in the wrong direction, basically, and part of this is coming from natural gas. So natural gas emissions are increasing, and this is particularly coming from Western Australia, which is the region we explore here, but basically what happened, because actually the domestic demand for gas has peaked, most likely, or at least has stagnated in Australia. However, there is a boom of exports of natural gas, so we know already why most people would agree that coal is not a good idea, and revenue from coal and exports from coal are probably decreasing at the international level. Well, this is not the main narrative with gas. The main narrative with gas is this is great. All the countries will phase out coal, and then we will have a huge market for our gas exports. So there's a lot of liquefied natural gas being exported now, and the main markets where they're exporting this is Asian economies, which are very big. Of course, you also see some of it is consumed domestically, but this is important that a lot of it is exported. And in this discussion, there was an inquiry to a scientific community to put together some information on what would it mean to explore the huge reserves of natural gas that are in Western Australia, because Western Australia at the moment is not very well connected to the East market, but it's a great location to export a lot of liquefied natural gas, and a lot of the resources, as you can see, they're huge, especially here in the Canning Basin. They're really, really big, are unconventional gas resources. So there was basically an inquiry from the Western Australia government to see, okay, what will be the implication of doing this, what are the risks, what are the social consequences, and so on. And we at Climate Analytics contributed with one report that then turned into this paper. And I'll try to summarize what we did. We tried to solve two main questions. One is, what's the carbon footprint of all of this if you were to actually go ahead with exploiting the resources? And second of all, what does it mean in terms of the national and international commitments of Australia and the Paris Agreement and so on. So yeah, very, very quickly through methodology. So of course, part of the gas is gonna be burned for electricity production or heat production. So yeah, that's a huge part of the carbon footprint. However, what is interesting for Western Australia and what's very interesting in particular for unconventional resources is that there is, a large part of the carbon footprint that's usually not very well understood, and there is very, very uncertain. So we try to estimate this better for Western Australia. There is natural release of CO2 in the production and extraction process. So based on the operating fields in Western Australia, you have a huge range that goes from this is conventional, for conventional operating fields, from 2% to 14% of natural CO2 release. So as I said, the uncertainty is very big. We take a very conservative estimate of 3.5, but if we were to do an average based on the production size, you will get to over 7%. So it's a huge uncertainty of how much of that is released. And similarly, and this is even a bigger problem because of the warming potential of methane, there is a lot of CH4 leakage in the in the extraction of natural gas. So again, to show you some of the estimates, this is 1.7, which we use because it's what the International Energy Agency is using usually as the average methane rate for conventional gas fields. But looking at operating fields, you can find up to 3% leakage rates for conventional ones. And for unconventional, it can go really wild. It can go up to 17%. So again, we use a conservative estimate of 6.5 for this. And those are our results, basically. So this small part here are the conventional gas resources in Western Australia if they were to be used. So the black, it was gray there, but it's the black square here will be, the usual carbon footprint when you burn this into CO2. Then this is a small portion of CO2 that is naturally released, as I said. And it becomes more interesting here when you factor in for the leakage. And so that's it for conventional resources. But when you look at the amount of unconventional resources in Western Australia, which is quite massive, you will see the dimensions of this take another level. This will be the normal carbon footprint, but then once you take into account different leakage rates, it goes to astronomical proportions in terms of carbon footprint. And to put it into context a little bit, we try to derive a carbon budget, of course, like globally, that is easy. But what is not so easy is to derive it for Australia, so how much of that corresponds to Australia, and even more difficult, how much of that corresponds to Western Australia. So that was a bit tricky. I'll explain what we did. So for the global carbon budget, that's very easy. It's based on the IPCC pathways, integrated assessment pathways, because this is Paris Agreement, and I think there is a lot of confusion going on. What is the long-term temperature target? So it's well below 2 degrees. So the scientific interpretation of that target that we're doing is at least 50% probability of getting to 1.5, and and higher than 2 degrees. So actually, that will mean around 80% probability of getting to 2 degrees. A lot of the other models that are called Paris Agreement, they usually take the 66% probability of 2 degrees, which is what was basically also done before the Paris Agreement. So we don't go with that. We go with the more stringent pathways and derive carbon budgets because, as you can see here, a lot of these models, actually most of them, rely on negative emissions in the second half of the century. We focus on carbon budgets until mid-century to kind of make more sense of this. And this is how it looks like. So from those global carbon budgets, we derive an Australian carbon budget making use of a model that we have that's called Siamese. It's a downscaler and emulator of energy system, and we are able to downscale to the Australian level. And then we go to Western Australia with a very basic methodology, actually, which is just assuming the same proportion of consumption that they have now. It will be more or less the same proportion that they have in the budget, and come up with 5.5 gigatons for Australia and around 1 gigaton for Western Australia as a carbon budget. So that's it. And again, coming back to the bubbles, then you see how much bigger the carbon footprint of conventional and unconventional natural gas resources is compared to the global carbon budget, and of course the Australian and Western Australian carbon budget is blown by any assumptions that you make. Even in the lower and most conservative assumptions in terms of these parameters, it's still too big. So that's our main conclusion on the first part of the study, and then I'm gonna go quickly through this. We do a lot of scenarios testing, because basically the industry, so as I said, and remember in the first slide, a lot of this is going to be exported. So it's like, oh, what do we care? It's not gonna be in our emissions inventory, so what do we care that this is higher than our actual budget, because a lot of this is exported. So we try to make a sophisticated scenario combining what the global demand will be for gas, if you make some assumptions, and how much of those emissions, even if Australia were to export a lot of that, will remain in Australia, because the extraction and processing and making it liquefied natural gas would still account for Australia's domestic emissions. So we try to do that and come up with a very similar conclusion. Basically, you'll see here, that's the budget for Australia. And this is the reference scenario, and then you have advanced renewable energy scenario for Australia. It doesn't really matter the difference right now, but you see that under all the scenarios consider only the upstream carbon footprint will be higher than the budget for the whole energy system in Australia. I'm not talking about carbon budget for gas, I'm talking for the entire energy system, so it's quite dramatic. And regardless of what you assume in terms of exports, because there is a large portion of emissions that will still remain in Western Australia. I think I have to finish now because I ran out of time, but what in the end this we wanted to show is that, yes, Australia is depending a lot on exports, and there's a lot of interest in the extracting industry, but there's also a lot of potential to become a global exporter, energy superpower exporter for renewable energy, because of a lot of the minerals that are needed for this transition are in Australia, because the technology is there, because there are a lot of opportunities. Maybe we can talk about it afterwards, but it's an idea that's been going around in Australia, and that's taken some strength, I think. And yeah, that was all. Thank you.
For all those presentations. So what we heard on this supply-side economics panel was Taran from Statistics Norway talk about, is supply-side policy still a good idea? And then Ivetta from IISD, what does carbon entanglement mean for the wealth of the largest owners of fossil fuels? And then from DIW Berlin, Franziska talked about the risk of asset stranding in a COALMOD-World model and reductions in supply under a 2 degrees scenario. Frank talked from the National Australia University, talked about phase-out options for steam coal market and what lower prices for coal mean, and coal taxes in particular. And then Paola from Climate Analytics looked at Western Australia's carbon footprint, including methane in particular and leakage rates, and how Western Australia will overshoot. So we had a lot of different presentations to look at, all from different angles, and we've got about 15 minutes left for questions, and I wonder if anyone wanted to kick off. We've got quite a few, maybe starting right from the top at the back, and we're going to take 3 at a time, please. And please say who you are when you speak.
Thank you very much. Sony Membunan from University of Indonesia. Thanks. This is more or less like a comment to the presentation from colleagues from IISD and DIW Berlin. I think it's interesting to see how you predict or you suggest that stranding asset will be, that you implied it will be direct and automatic in countries like Indonesia. I would like to invite you to come tomorrow to my session. I will argue somewhat differently. The biases I come from the very context of the study. So I would argue that it's not necessarily stranding. We seem to be underestimating the capacity of, say, political economic process inducing domestic markets, so that coal resources not directly stranding, or it's still there. It might also be of relevance to the analysis of Frank in terms of fiscal revenues from coal. In countries like Indonesia, where revenue collection from coal is basically low.
Okay, so hands back up again. If we just take those two, and then for the next round, I'll come down here.
Thank you. Jeremy Moss from the University of New South Wales in Sydney. Really a question to Taran, but also more generally. So when we're assessing whether a country like Norway, or indeed a country like Australia, ought to reduce its exports of fossil fuels, don't we have to break the link, or at least weaken the link, between thinking about impact as just a direct reduction of emissions? So if Norway's exports are responsible for whatever it was, 2% of the world's emissions, well, that's significant, although it's not that significant. But I put it to you that if a country like Norway, or indeed Australia, introduced significant production costs, that would have an enormous impact. That would have a huge impact on how every other country saw action on climate change. And so that impact has to be measured, I think, more broadly than just a reduction in emissions. But also when we're, well, I'll leave it there, actually.
Kjell Kühne from the Leave It in the Ground initiative, Lingo. I have a question to Paola that might seem a little bit nerdy, but it's not. The question is, are you using global warming potential for 100 years or for 20 years to compare the methane leakage? You want to answer right away? 100. So maybe to explain why it's an important question is methane stays in the atmosphere for 12 years. And in those 12 years, it's more than 100 times more potent than CO2. But we tend to use the 100-year figure, which waters it down with 88 years when it's not there. And then it comes out at 36 times as potent as CO2. So actually, if you compare gas with coal, and there's more than about 3% leakage with a 20-year figure, then gas is worse than coal. And that's a big argument that can be used against the lock into fossil gas that we're seeing currently in many places.
So we've got 3 questions there, or 1 point and 2 questions. Did anyone want to pick up on any of those 3 points? I think, Paola, you answered one, so there were two others. Frank, did you want to pick up? Okay, if you go first.
Oh, yes. Okay. So just a quick comment on Indonesia, I guess, Sonny. I don't know. I guess for Indonesia, there would be a risk of lock-in into very low-value exports potentially, right? So, you know, it's an obvious risk. It's a big industry. It's readily accessible. It's politically well-connected. And it could, you know, be among the last mines still standing, supplying into, you know, remnants of the Asian market that take coal at very low cost. And then, yeah, I guess your government at the time then needs to consider whether that is in fact worth it ultimately, right? So there's also, of course, these complex issues of quality of coal, not just in terms of calorific content, but also sulfur and ash. An argument that's often made in Australia is that, you know, we have lower sulfur, lower ash coal, and that will beat Indonesian coal in the Asian markets because there's such an emphasis on local pollution in the consuming countries, and so all of these things need to be considered, I think, in that as we consider this kind of, you know, race to supply the last few 100 million tons of coal.
Respond to any other points?
I got a question. So I would very much like to discuss that more. Yes, of course, the signaling effects are considerable, I guess. But for the politicians in Norway, I think it's a very far from taking that into account. It's already difficult to persuade them that there will be some contributions actually in the climate by doing supply side policies. They are not credited for that in the agreements or in the commitments they have, so it's already very difficult to try to persuade in those terms. So signaling effects are really difficult to show or to get numbers on, so it's easily ignored. But I do agree with you that there might be some big potentials there, especially if we join forces across different suppliers.
Great. So we can move on to the next three questions. And probably because of timing, we'll have to make these the last ones. So if anyone actually really is pressing and wants to ask a question, put your hand up and I'll try and get you in.
Thanks. Hannah McKinnon with Oil Change. Taran, you started to answer my question. I was curious to know of the reception that you got for that recommendation within the Norwegian political context. Is there a pathway for Norway to show leadership in establishing such a club? The second is a broader question / observation, and Paola, you were very specific about it in your presentation in how you reflect what I think were hard-fought ambition gains in Paris, which is 80% below 2, aspiring for well below 2 and 1.5. We've heard in a lot of presentations sort of, I think, a simplification of it, the 2-degree target, which to me is the Copenhagen era target. So I'm just wondering collectively, are we doing enough to reflect that ambition increase that we saw with Paris in the way we talk about this, which obviously has implications ranging from carbon budgets to stranded assets across the board? So that's a broader question perhaps for the panel.
Thank you. Roberto Schaefer from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. I have a simple question to Paola, and somehow is related to the GWP that was mentioned before. In 2 weeks' time, the IPCC is going to be releasing the new special report on 1.5, and a lot of discussions are going to be there related to carbon budget and things like that. So I cannot anticipate what's in there. But a simple question is, Paola, you mentioned, let's say, carbon budget for CO2 for 1.5 and 2 degrees, but then when you show your result, we're talking about CO2 equivalent. How did your model play with CO2 and CO2 equivalent? It's not an issue of GWP, it's more sophisticated than that. How your model deal with non-CO2 gases in a carbon budget that's defined for CO2 only?
Hi, Jonathan Strauch from University of Waterloo. I have a question about Australia, about the politics. I'm wondering, in the debate that you're discussing, whether you can see a role of the high penetration of residential solar. So when they have that poster, right, no coldies without coal, is that weakened by people seeing solar around, or in general, how does that, is there sort of a scissor there in the politics where the supply of clean energy and the actions against fossil fuel supplies are working together?
Okay, so if we just take those three questions, and because of time, we're going to have these as wrap-up, if you want to make wrap-up points. And I'll just add on the IPCC findings for 1.5 degrees, which we will hear come up in a few weeks. Suspicions is they're going to say that the carbon budget to 1.5 is much bigger than we're currently saying that it is, which is going to throw a kind of spanner in the works to a lot of your calculations. So if you want to respond to that as well, please do.
So maybe, is this on? Yep. Maybe because it's kind of related to my question. So it is a bit complicated to talk about carbon budgets, and we actually have written a briefing on this. And this whole debate: is it bigger? Is it smaller? How big the carbon budget is? How much does it rely on negative emissions? What does this mean for the 1.5 and so on? It's very valid, and it's, I think, a very interesting conversation. But yeah. So unfortunately, by the time we produced this, we still didn't have the results from the IPCC, so we rely on some of the things that have been published, but the full database is not available, as you know, and we can't do this fully in our model. That will do more assumptions for downscaling other gases. So the very basic approach is, okay, let's look at the CO2 carbon budget. We know for other gases like methane, it will be like it needs to stabilize, and then at some point the negative emissions will compensate for this. So it is very complex, but at least because you saw the figures are so dramatic, it makes a point that you cannot exploit all of these resources and think you're within any possible plausible carbon budget ever. So that's kind of a part of the answer related to what you say, what we always think. So for this case in particular, carbon budgets and carbon footprint was a useful concept to make a point of the reserves compared to the actual carbon budget. But what we usually think it's way more interesting, because this whole discussion about carbon budgets also has to do with the assumptions behind the climate models and the temperature models, which is very complex as well. What is more interesting, and what we always try to reflect on, also to make sure that we get Paris Agreement compatible benchmarks, is the pathway, how you get there. Because a carbon budget doesn't tell you anything about the pathway as such, and we reflect more on the pathways, and the pathways are very clear, and this is also in the Paris Agreement, the carbon neutrality or the net zero emissions in the second half of the century. So most of these pathways will show you very close to zero, or at least for fossil fuels, decarbonized economies by 2050.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, sorry,
So,
it was long.
did anyone else want to comment on some of those questions?
I would like to thank you for the follow-up on the club. What kind of club could that be? That is a very interesting research question that we need to go into. Who would join that? Who would benefit from that? That is, first of all, economies that are ambitious on the climate issue, and also have high costs of doing abatement domestically, and also have rather high costs of exploring and exploiting their resources, fossil fuel resources. And I think Norway is one of those candidates, but it would be an interesting topic to go further on that. The problem for Norway, and I guess also for other suppliers, are that they are not credited in any way, as is in the agreement. So that could become a topic.
Great. So, did you want to add a final point?
Yeah. So solar power is popular in Australia. You see that in the opinion polls, and it's running away with it economically now as well. So domestically, the only question really is, how quickly or how slowly the existing coal-fired power plants will be closed down. There will not be a new one commercially built unless the government is crazy enough to provide massive subsidies for it. Okay, so that race is over, pretty much. But the question of coal mining for export is a much bigger one, and one that isn't really yet in the public debate, other than from a sort of ethically, morally infused kind of viewpoint as to we as a nation should not be providing coal because of climate change, right? But that is a relatively unsophisticated debate, of course, right? Because it doesn't take into account the economics of it, I would say, right? I mean, the debate as it's playing out publicly, I think you will agree, is not really at a point yet where we can have an informed conversation about what is actually best for the country from a long-term perspective, right? You know, I don't know how long it'll take to get there, but that conversation needs to be had, right, before it goes down the hill in terms of coal exports and massive investments still there, supplying into a diminishing market.
So I want to thank this panel as we wrap up on the economics of supply side climate policy. I think one of the things to remember is that 80% of the world's population, thereabouts, live in energy importing countries, and just 20% live in energy exporting countries. And if I was a betting man to work out who's going to win in that particular battle, I think rather it's going to be the importing countries that are going to hold up and say, well, actually, we need to rethink this. I think India spends, is it $60 billion a year on costs of energy importation? So there's a huge incentive for them to really replace fossil fuel imports. And that's really going to be a major driver to support the arguments we've heard today. So thanks very much.